December 24th, 1944. Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. Midnight approached in Barracks 7, and Klaus Becker lay awake in the darkness, breath visible in the frozen air. Outside, wind rattled through bare pine branches like skeletal fingers scratching at memory. He expected nothing. Christmas had died for him 18 months ago in the Tunisian desert, when British artillery had torn his regiment apart and American guns had finished what remained. Since then, captivity had taught him a singular lesson: want nothing, expect less, survive the space between. Before we continue, hit the like button if you're ready for a story that shows hope surviving even the darkest moments of war. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe if you haven't, because stories like this remind us who we truly are. At 11 p.m., the barracks lights suddenly blazed back on. Guards entered, but not with their usual mechanical efficiency. Sergeant Wilson stood at the door, nervous energy radiating from his posture, and called out in broken German, supplemented by urgent gestures. Everyone up. Everyone out. Formation in 5 minutes. 300 German prisoners exchanged worried glances in the sudden brightness. Klaus swung his legs off his bunk, heart hammering, mind racing through possibilities: security incident, punishment detail, some regulation violated, some consequence descending. They dressed quickly, filed outside into Oklahoma cold that cut through their camp-issue coats like razors through paper. They formed loose rows facing the Central Recreation Building, a structure normally dark and administrative and utterly forgettable. And then Klaus heard something impossible. Music, singing in English but unmistakably a Christmas carol. The recreation building's doors opened, and warm light spilled across frozen ground like liquid gold. Inside, through windows that glowed with impossible promise, Klaus could see what looked like decorations, colored paper chains, and impossibly, incredibly, a Christmas tree fully decorated, standing in the corner, lights flickering on its branches like stars that had somehow survived the war. In that moment, staring at those lights through Oklahoma darkness 3,000 miles from home, Klaus realized something that shattered every certainty he'd built to survive captivity. His enemies had just given him back his humanity. The road to that moment had been long and brutal. In May 1943, the Afrika Korps had surrendered in Tunisia 125,000 German soldiers, including Klaus, who had survived Rommel's retreat across Libya, only to find themselves trapped against the Mediterranean with nowhere left to run. They had expected execution, perhaps, or starvation in desert prison camps. Instead, they found themselves processed through military channels with startling efficiency, assigned numbers, stripped of weapons and insignia and any illusions about returning home soon, then loaded onto ships bound for America. Klaus had arrived at Camp Gruber in September 1943, one of the first waves of Afrika Korps veterans to reach Oklahoma's dense pine forests. The camp sprawled across 40,000 acres of rolling hills in the state's northeastern corner. It had been built in 1942 as a training facility for American infantry divisions, but by late 1943 it also served as a prisoner of war camp. The contradiction was surreal. American soldiers trained for combat on one section of the camp, while German soldiers who had already seen combat worked and waited and wondered if they'd ever see home again on another. By December 1944, Camp Gruber housed roughly 300 German prisoners. Klaus was 26 years old now, though he felt decades older. 18 months of captivity had worn grooves into his soul, the dull routine of imprisoned existence, the uncertainty about family back home, the grinding monotony of days that stretched into weeks, into months, with no end visible. He worked on maintenance details, kept his head down, wrote letters home that may or may not have reached Munich, and tried not to think too much about his mother, his sister, the house that might no longer be standing, the family that might no longer be living. The camp treated its prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, which meant adequate food, shelter, medical care, and work assignments that kept them occupied without violating international law. Compared to what Klaus had heard about Russian camps or what he feared American captivity might entail, It was humane. But humanity and kindness were different things. The guards maintained professional distance. The barbed wire remained. The guard towers stood sentinel. And Christmas, as it approached in late 1944, meant nothing at all, except some Americans had different ideas. Sergeant James Wilson was 42 years old, too old for infantry service, assigned to camp duty after 20 years of peacetime Army routine. He had a wife named Margaret and 3 children in Tulsa, and a fundamental decency that sometimes made his job difficult. When he looked at German prisoners, he saw men. Tired men, homesick men, beaten men who had made the mistake of being born in the wrong country at the wrong time and had survived when perhaps they shouldn't have. 3 weeks before Christmas, during a visit home, Margaret had asked a simple question while wrapping presents for their children. The house smelled of pine from the tree they'd cut at a local lot. The radio played carols. Everything was warm and bright and impossibly normal. "What will the German prisoners do for Christmas?" she'd asked, taping paper around a toy truck. Wilson paused. He realized he'd never considered the question. "Nothing, I suppose. We don't celebrate their holidays." Margaret looked up, her hands stilling. "Nothing? That's awful, James. It's Christmas. They're prisoners, but they're also men. Men with families somewhere, probably. Men who used to celebrate Christmas before all this." She went back to her wrapping, but her tone carried the weight of moral certainty that had made Wilson fall in love with her 20 years earlier. Someone should do something, even something small. The conversation stayed with Wilson like a splinter under skin. Back at Camp Gruber, he found himself watching the German prisoners more carefully. The way they moved through their days with mechanical efficiency, but no real purpose. The way some of them stared at the pine trees surrounding the camp, and Wilson realized they were probably thinking of German forests, German Christmases, German families gathered around tables that might not even exist anymore. He approached Colonel Robert Henderson with his idea, carefully framing it in both moral and practical terms. "Permission to speak freely, sir. I'd like to organize something for the German prisoners for Christmas. Nothing elaborate, just a tree, maybe some decorations. Let them have a few hours that feel different from every other day." When Henderson asked why, Wilson had his answer ready: "Because it's the right thing to do. Geneva Convention requires we treat them humanely. Seems to me humanity includes acknowledging they might miss their families at Christmas." Henderson studied him for a long moment, fingers steepled, weighing regulations against conscience. Finally, "Nothing that could be construed as fraternization. Nothing that compromises security. And it comes out of goodwill funds or donations, not official military budget." Clear? Wilson left with permission and immediately began the logistical work of transforming an abstract idea into concrete reality. He recruited allies among the guards. Most were skeptical, but a few understood what he was trying to do. The camp chaplain, Captain Robert Morris, became an enthusiastic supporter. Together they quietly assembled resources. A local farmer donated a 12-foot pine tree, freshly cut. The camp carpenter's shop built wooden ornaments. American soldiers contributed pennies and nickels toward purchasing small gifts: tobacco, writing paper, soap, chocolate bars. Margaret Wilson organized the officers' wives to bake cookies, hundreds of them, packed into tins. The prisoners knew something was happening, but not what. They saw the pine tree being moved into a storage building. They noticed increased activity around the mess hall. Guards who normally maintained professional distance seemed oddly friendly in the days leading up to December 25th. Rumors circulated in German through the barracks, perhaps a Red Cross visit, perhaps news about prisoner exchanges, perhaps some policy change they hadn't been informed about. Klaus didn't speculate much. He had learned that hope was dangerous, that expectations led to disappointment, that the best survival strategy was to want nothing and be surprised by anything. His last real Christmas had been 1942 in North Africa, sharing a tin of sardines with his unit while British artillery shook the ground. Before that, 1941 in Germany, his mother's house in Munich, the smell of stolen, the sound of carols, his sister's children opening presents while the war seemed far away and manageable, and not yet the all-consuming monster it would become. And then came December 24th. The day passed like any other. Morning roll call, work assignments, lunch, afternoon labor, dinner, evening in the barracks. Nothing suggested this night would be different except perhaps the way some guards seemed barely able to contain smiles, the way Sergeant Wilson kept checking his watch as if waiting for something. When the lights blazed back on at 11 p.m. and they were ordered outside into formation, Klaus felt only confusion and worry. Standing in the Oklahoma cold, watching his breath ghost in the floodlight beams, he heard those impossible sounds: music, singing, carols, and then Sergeant Wilson stepped forward with Captain Morris beside him. "Gentlemen," Wilson began, his breath clouding in the cold air, "it's Christmas Eve. We know you're far from home. We know you're prisoners. We know this year has been hard for all of us, though in different ways." He paused, letting the camp's German interpreter translate. "Tonight, for a few hours, we want to do something different. We want to give you Christmas. Not as Americans, not as guards, just as men who understand what it means to miss home during the holidays. You're invited inside. There's food, decorations, some gifts, no strings attached, no favors expected. Just Christmas. Because even in war, some things should be sacred." Silence held for a long moment. 300 German prisoners stood in the Oklahoma cold, trying to process information that contradicted everything they'd been taught about their enemies, everything they'd experienced of captivity, everything that made sense about the world they inhabited. Then slowly, carefully, they began to move forward. The recreation building couldn't hold everyone at once, so they entered in groups of 50, rotating through in shifts that would take all night. Klaus was in the third group, which meant waiting outside for nearly an hour, stamping feet against cold, watching other prisoners emerge with expressions he couldn't quite read: shock, maybe, or wonder, or something that had no easy name. When his turn came, he stepped through the doors and stopped, breath catching in his chest. The room had been transformed. Paper chains in red and green stretched across the ceiling, like captured pieces of celebration. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with wooden ornaments painted in bright colors, with strings of popcorn, with a star at its top made from tin foil that caught the light and threw it back in defiance of darkness. Tables along the walls groaned under food, cookies, cakes, fruit, chocolate, coffee, things that exceeded standard prisoner rations by such magnitude that it seemed like hallucination. And in the center of the room, a group of American soldiers stood holding songbooks. They began to sing, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." The melody was universal, transcending language. After the first verse, one of the German prisoners joined in, singing in German, then another, then more, until the room filled with two languages intertwining, creating harmony where war had found only conflict. Klaus felt something break inside his chest, not his spirit that had been broken and rebuilt too many times to break again. Something else. Some wall he'd built between himself and feeling, some protective barrier that had let him survive captivity by treating it as merely continuation of combat by other means. But enemies didn't do this. Enemies didn't put up Christmas trees and sing carols and provide cookies baked by their wives for men who had been trying to harm them months earlier. Enemies didn't create beauty in barracks. Enemies didn't acknowledge shared humanity. Enemies didn't care if prisoners missed home at Christmas. The singing continued through several carols, both languages mixing, voices finding harmony where politics had found only conflict. When the music ended, Captain Morris stepped forward. "There are gifts on the table, small things. Take what you want. And there's food, more than enough. You have 1 hour. Eat, rest, remember what it feels like to have Christmas." Klaus moved forward tentatively, still half expecting the illusion to shatter. But the cookies were real. The chocolate was real. The small packages on the tables were real. He took a cookie, bit into it, tasted butter and sugar and cinnamon and someone's kitchen in America, someone somewhere whose oven worked and whose ingredients were available and who still made beautiful things for no reason except that beauty mattered. Tears welled in his eyes without warning. He tried to stop them, embarrassed, but around him other men were crying too. Grown soldiers weeping into cookies while American guards looked away to grant them privacy. Hans Muller, the carpenter, stood before the Christmas tree, touching the wooden ornaments with careful fingers, recognizing craftsmanship, understanding the work that had gone into creating these small, perfect things. Friedrich Weber, the school teacher, was reading aloud from a card on the wall that contained the lyrics to O Tannenbaum in German, his voice breaking on familiar words that connected him to a past that felt impossibly distant. Otto Schmidt, the farmer's son, was eating apple pie with focused intensity that suggested he was tasting his mother's kitchen, his family's table, everything he'd lost. Klaus sat with several other prisoners, eating cookies, drinking coffee, talking quietly in German about Christmases they remembered. Not the war years, but before childhood memories of snow and family and the feeling of safety that had seemed permanent until it ended. "My mother made stollen every year," Klaus said softly. "She would start days in advance, soaking the fruit, preparing the dough. The whole house would smell like Christmas." "I remember Christmas markets," Hans offered. "In Munich, the stalls selling toys and decorations and roasted almonds. Taking my daughter, holding her hand while she looked at everything with such wonder. They were quiet then, each man lost in his own past, each carrying the weight of not knowing if those places still existed, if those people still lived, if any of that world could be recovered, or if it was gone forever, replaced by this strange present where enemy guards gave them Christmas and grown men cried over cookies. When their hour ended, they filed back outside into the cold. Klaus looked back once at the warm-lit building, at the Christmas tree visible through the window, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, gratitude. Not for captivity, not for war, not for any of the circumstances that had brought him here, but for this moment, this unexpected kindness, this reminder that humanity could survive even when everything else was stripped away. The rotations continued through the night. Group after group entered the recreation building, experienced their hour of Christmas, emerged, changed in ways they couldn't quite articulate. By dawn, all 300 prisoners had been through. The American guards who had organized this were exhausted but satisfied, having witnessed something they knew was important, even if they couldn't fully explain why. Christmas Day itself was quieter. The prisoners returned to normal routines, but something had shifted. They moved with less of the heavy resignation that had characterized their previous months. They spoke more freely with guards who no longer seemed quite so much like enemies. The camp felt different, the atmosphere subtly transformed by the recognition that the men on both sides of the wire were just that men, capable of both kindness and cruelty, but choosing in this instance to reach across the divide that war had created. Meanwhile, the war pushed forward with mechanical brutality. 8 days earlier, Hitler had launched the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major Western offensive. On Christmas Day, as Klaus wrote to a mother he wasn't sure lived in a city, he wasn't sure stood, American soldiers fought and died in Belgian snow. The war was nearing its end, though no one yet knew it. But in Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, 300 German prisoners received something greater than physical gifts: recognition. Recognition that they were men, not just enemies, that they carried loss, memory, and hope. Years later, Klaus told of the decorations, the soft glow of lanterns, the quiet singing, and the homemade cookies that somehow made grown men weep. Sergeant Wilson remembered that night just as vividly, proud not of any battle he had survived, but of a moment of kindness that felt bigger than the war surrounding them. The camp faded, the building vanished, the uniforms were folded away, yet that night endured unchanged, unforgotten, untouched by time. It altered nothing in the official record of World War II, but it mattered deeply to the people who lived it. In war, enemies existed by definition, but that night they saw individuals, tired young men, far from home, each carrying fear, hope, and longing. And for one unlikely evening in Oklahoma in 1944, 300 German prisoners and a handful of American guards created something that defied every rule of conflict. A fragile, luminous moment of peace. A gesture of grace that reminded them that even in darkness, humanity could flare like a candle. A Christmas that proved kindness could still break through, even when the world was at war.